200,000 miles from Earth. That's roughly the distance from our planet to the moon, and it's where 3 American astronauts found themselves on the night of April 13, 1970, staring down death with nowhere to run. This is the story of Apollo 13, the mission that should have ended in catastrophe, and the moment Commander Jim Lovell realized his spacecraft was dying around him. Welcome back to this channel. If you love incredible true stories of human survival against impossible odds, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this is one you won't forget. Let's rewind to the beginning. April 11, 1970, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. The Saturn V rocket stood on pad 39A like a towering monument to human ambition. At its apex sat the Apollo 13 spacecraft, ready to carry 3 men to the moon. Commander Jim Lovell had been here before. He'd orbited the moon with Apollo 8 in 1968, had walked in space, had logged more hours in the cosmos than almost any living human. This was his shot. This was the mission where he would finally set foot on the lunar surface. Standing beside Lovell were 2 other astronauts. Jack Swigert, a newcomer to the program, was brought in as a last-minute replacement after the original pilot, Ken Mattingly, was exposed to German measles. And Fred Haise, the lunar module pilot, a test pilot and engineer who'd been preparing his entire life for this moment, at 13 p.m. Eastern Time. The Saturn V's 5 massive F1 engines ignited. The ground shook. The sky erupted. Millions watched as the rocket climbed skyward, carrying 3 men toward the edge of human exploration. Nobody knew it yet, but only hours into the flight, the first signs of trouble would appear. Just a few minutes after launch, the center engine of the S2 stage shut down 2 minutes early, a glitch no one expected. The other 4 engines burned longer to compensate. Then on the 3rd stage, another anomaly, but the trajectory was still good. The computers said they could reach the moon. Mission control in Houston cleared them to continue. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise settled in for the long coast to the moon. They were on what NASA called a free return trajectory, a path that would automatically swing them around the moon and back toward Earth. Even if something went wrong with the main engine, it was the safest route, or so everyone believed. 2 days into the flight, the mood was routine. The mission was going smoothly. In Houston, flight controllers were relaxed. The astronauts were doing their jobs, conducting experiments, taking star sightings for navigation. By all accounts, Apollo 13 was on track to make history. 9:08 p.m. April 13, 1970. In mission control, Ecomsci Lieberget, the systems engineer monitoring the spacecraft's electrical and environmental systems, had requested a routine maintenance procedure. He asked the crew to stir the cryogenic tanks, the massive liquid oxygen and hydrogen containers that powered the fuel cells, supplying electricity and water to the entire spacecraft. It was a simple procedure. You turn on little fans inside the tanks to stir the contents, making sure the liquid didn't stratify, and then you got an accurate volume reading. They'd done it before. They'd do it again. Jack Swigert flipped the switch at 9:07 p.m. Houston time for exactly 1 second. Nothing happened. Then bang, it wasn't a massive explosion. It was more like a muffled thud, almost gentle, as if someone had struck the spacecraft with a hammer. But it was felt throughout the entire vehicle. The crew heard it. Mission control heard it. Alarms immediately started blaring on the command module. Lights flashed across the instrument panels like a Christmas tree gone haywire. Warning lights, alarm indicators. The master alarm sound that freezes the blood of any astronaut who hears it, because it means something. Somewhere has gone catastrophically wrong. Swigert's voice crackled back to Houston. Houston, we've had a problem here. Mission control responded. We've had a problem. We've had a main be under volt. But Lovell wasn't thinking about bus voltages. He was looking at his instruments, watching them degrade in real time. One by one, critical systems were failing. He looked at the readouts for the fuel cells, the 3 units that powered the entire spacecraft. One was already dropping. Then another. The 3rd was still holding, but barely. Lovell realized what was happening. Houston, he radioed, we've got more than one problem here. We've had a main be under volt. What they didn't know yet was that this wasn't just an electrical glitch. It was the beginning of the end. 13 minutes after the explosion, Lovell did something on pure instinct. He looked out the left window of the command module, peering into the darkness of space. And there it was, a sight that would burn into his memory forever. "Houston," he said, his voice measured and calm, even as his mind was racing. "We are venting something out into space." Mission Control asked. "Roger. What kind of venting are we seeing? It as a gas of some sort." Lovell replied it was oxygen. Both oxygen tanks were bleeding their contents into the vacuum of space at an alarming rate. The second tank, which had ruptured first, was already empty. The first tank was rapidly following. Within an hour, both tanks would be completely drained. And without oxygen, there would be no electrical power. Without electrical power, the command module would be dead. And without the command module, 3 men were going to die in space. This is the moment Jim Lovell knew. Looked at his instruments. He calculated the numbers in his head, the same calculations he'd done 1,000 times in the simulator. He watched the oxygen pressure gauge ticking downward, slowly but inexorably. 100 psi, 90 psi, 80 psi, and there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. He knew at that point, Lovell would later say in an interview, that we were in a dying vehicle. The whole command module was going to be dead. 12 fuel cells down. The third fuel cell would follow when the oxygen was gone. Once that happened, the command module's guidance computer would go offline. The rocket engine wouldn't work. The life support systems would shut down. They would have no propulsion, no control, and no way to get home. They'd be 200,000 miles from Earth, traveling at 2,000 miles per hour, in a spacecraft with no electricity, no oxygen, and no way to steer for most men. This would be the moment of complete despair. But Lovell wasn't most men. He'd trained for emergencies his entire career. He'd flown Gemini 7 in 1965 and spent 2 weeks in space with Frank Borman to prove that humans could survive in zero gravity for extended periods. He'd done a spacewalk on Gemini 12. He'd orbited the moon on Apollo 8, becoming one of the first humans to see Earthrise, that iconic photograph of our planet rising over the lunar horizon. He was an expert pilot, a seasoned explorer, and most importantly, he was a problem solver, and there was a solution. There had to be. "Fred, Jack," Lovell said calmly, "we need to get into the lunar module." Now, the lunar module, code-named Aquarius, was the small spacecraft attached to the command module. It was designed to carry 2 astronauts down to the lunar surface for about 2 days, and then back up to rendezvous with the command module. It had its own oxygen. It had its own power systems. It had its own life support bit. It was never designed for 3 people. And it was never designed for a 4-day journey. Homies Lovell, Swigert, and Haise made their way through the tunnel connecting the 2 spacecraft. The weight of what they were about to attempt began to sink in. They were abandoning the command module, the most advanced spacecraft ever built, and moving into a lifeboat that was barely larger than a closet. A lifeboat with life support systems designed for a fraction of what was now demanded of them. They were trading one death trap for another, hoping that the second one might just barely keep them alive long enough to get home. The lunar module Aquarius was about the size of a small bathroom. Imagine standing in a phone booth with 2 other people. That's roughly the space available to Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise for the next 4 days. But the real problem wasn't the cramped quarters. It was that every single system aboard the lunar module was now running at absolute maximum capacity, trying to do something it was never designed to do. The first crisis hit within hours. The 3 men huddled in the LM, watching their readouts and trying to figure out what to do next. The carbon dioxide levels inside the cabin began to rise. You see, humans breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. The lunar module had lithium hydroxide canisters that absorbed the CO2 from the air, keeping the atmosphere breathable. 2 canisters. They were designed to support 2 men for 2 days. Now they had to support 3 men for 4 days in the cramped cabin. The CO2 meters climbed 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%, and it kept climbing. The engineers at Mission Control in Houston watched the numbers tick upward and realized they had a catastrophic problem. If the CO2 levels got too high, the astronauts would be poisoned by their own breath. They would get headaches, confusion, reduced consciousness. Eventually, they would lose consciousness entirely, and then they would die. For the third time in a few hours, the situation seemed hopeless, but then something remarkable happened. The engineers in Houston, hundreds of them working in shifts, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, began to solve the problem. They realized that the command module had plenty of lithium hydroxide canisters in reserve. They were designed for the trip home, when the astronauts would have to power up the command module for re-entry. But there was a problem. The canisters in the command module were square-shaped. They fit into square receptacles. The canisters in the lunar module were cylindrical. They fit into round receptacles. You couldn't fit a square peg into a round hole. Not without help, so the engineers did something brilliant. They looked at what was available to the astronauts: plastic bags, cardboard from the flight procedures manual, hoses from the spacesuits, duct tape, and they improvised. They designed an adapter using materials that were physically present in the spacecraft: square canisters, plastic bags, duct tape, flexible hosking crans. The legendary flight director in mission control gave the order: whatever any of these three engineers ask of you, you will do. He radioed up to Lovell: we're going to have you take the lithium hydroxide cartridge from the command module and use it in the lunar module. We're working on a way to make it fit in our later. After some improvisational engineering that would have made MacGyver proud, the new CO2 scrubber was working. The carbon dioxide levels that had been climbing dangerously began to fall. In 60 minutes, the CO2 had dropped from dangerous levels to safe-zone crisis averted. But there were more coming, much more. If you think the worst was over, you'd be wrong. The lunar module was now acting as a lifeboat, but it had never been designed for this. Every system was running at maximum capacity, and that meant the module was generating heat. A lot of heat. Solution was simple: turn off systems that weren't essential. But in a spacecraft, almost everything is essential. Turn off the wrong thing and you could die. So mission control made the call. They'd shut down non-critical systems to reduce power consumption and heat generation. But here's the thing about shutting down systems in a spacecraft: the things that generate heat are the things that keep you warm. Temperature inside the lunar module began to drop. It started slowly. No one noticed at first, but over the course of hours, degree by degree, the cabin grew colder and colder and colder. Fred Haise was hit the hardest. Before the mission, doctors warned the astronauts about dehydration. If they didn't consume enough water, their bodies couldn't excrete toxins. Those toxins would build up in their kidneys. On the long journey home, restricted water consumption meant Haise's kidneys couldn't filter out the waste. He developed a urinary tract infection, and then a kidney infection. Every time he urinated, it burned. The pain was constant, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. In a spacecraft flying through the vacuum of space, Jim Lovell, looking at his crewmates suffering, did the only thing he could do. Whenever Haise got too cold, Lovell would give him a bear hug, wrapping his own body around Haise's, trying to transfer his body heat. It was a simple act of human compassion. In the face of impossible circumstance, water situation was getting critical. In a normal mission, the astronauts would have access to plenty of water. But on Apollo 13, water was also used for cooling the spacecraft systems. With more people and more systems running at maximum capacity, the water supply was being rapidly consumed. Eventually, the water rationing became severe. Each astronaut was allowed 6 ounces per day. 6 ounces! That's about the amount you'd get in a small cup of coffee to drink, to eat, to wash, to survive. Lovell described it later: we got clammy. The walls were perspiring. The windows were completely wet with condensation. By the time they began their journey home, the temperature inside the lunar module had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That's just above freezing. In their spacesuits, wearing every piece of clothing they could find, including the thermal protection they brought for the lunar surface, they were still shivering, exhausted, and running on fumes. Fred Haise, suffering from his kidney infection and the severe dehydration, was barely able to stay conscious. Lovell and Swigert took turns monitoring him, making sure he was okay, trying to keep him warm, trying to keep him alive. But here's where it gets even more complicated. On a free return trajectory meant the spacecraft would naturally swing around the moon and head back toward Earth. But there was a problem. The explosion had altered their trajectory slightly. If they didn't make a correction, they would miss Earth entirely. They'd sail right past our planet and into deep space, where they would eventually run out of oxygen, water, and power they needed to perform what's called a course correction burn. They needed to fire the engines of the lunar module to adjust their trajectory and ensure they'd hit the re-entry corridor when they came back. But here's the challenge. The lunar module's guidance computer was powered down. To conserve power, almost all of the spacecraft electronic systems had been shut off. The primary guidance system, the sophisticated computer that could calculate precise burns, was gone. The autopilot was gone. The star trackers that could give them accurate information about their orientation in space were gone. Lovell had his sextant, an ancient navigation instrument that had been carried on the Apollo 8 mission to the moon as a backup, just in case the computers failed. He would sight on celestial objects, take measurements, and use math to figure out where they were and where they needed to be. And he'd have to manually align the spacecraft and fire the engines by hand 3 times. The astronauts performed these manual burns 3 times. They had to carefully position their spacecraft, sight on Earth in the window of the capsule, and execute precise engine burns while trusting that their calculations were correct. Tone mistake. One miscalculation, one deviation of a few degrees, and they would miss Earth. They would sail past our planet into the cold darkness of space. No rescue, no return. Just slow, inevitable death. First burn was performed 2 hours after they took refuge in the lunar module. It was the most critical burn, the one that would change their trajectory from an overshoot to a course that would intersect with Earth. Lovell aligned the spacecraft so that the sun was positioned in a specific place relative to Earth. He used the crosshairs in the window to center Earth in the guidance marks. Then he and Swigert fired the descent engine of the lunar module briefly. They felt thrust. It wasn't much, just a few seconds of acceleration, but it was enough. The burn was successful. The second burn came 4 hours later. The third came near the end of the journey. Each burn required intense concentration. Each burn carried the weight of 3 lives. But each burn worked after 4 days of living in a closet-sized spacecraft, drinking 6 ounces of water, shivering in near-freezing temperatures. The 3 astronauts faced their final trial. They were going to have to do this manually. Re-entry: they had to leave the lunar module and return to the command module. In the command module, they have to fire up all the systems that had been shut down to preserve power. They had to turn on the guidance computer, the navigation systems, the communication systems, and the life support. And they had to do it perfectly, because if any of those systems didn't work, the re-entry would fail. As Lovell powered up the command module, he was acutely aware of one critical question. Had the heat shield been damaged in the explosion? The heat shield was a layer of ablative material on the bottom of the command module, designed to burn away during re-entry, dissipating the tremendous heat generated by atmospheric friction. Without an intact heat shield, the command module would be vaporized by temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The explosion had damaged a large section of the service module, ripping off an entire panel. Had that damage extended to the heat shield? No one knew, and there was no way to find out until they tried to re-enter in mission control. The conversation was grim. Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team had done everything right. They'd solved every problem. They kept 3 men alive 200,000 miles from home. But now they could do nothing. The spacecraft was committed. It was going to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Either the heat shield would hold, or it wouldn't. Either they would survive, or they wouldn't go for entry. Kranz said finally the spacecraft began its descent into Earth's atmosphere. The friction at that altitude began to generate heat. Lots of heat. The temperature outside the capsule climbed 2,000 degrees. The plasma surrounding the spacecraft became so ionized that radio waves couldn't penetrate it. Communications. One dead mission control lost signal. The astronauts lost signal. for 6 agonizing minutes longer than the normal 3-minute blackout. Because Apollo 13's trajectory was shallower and longer than usual, there was nothing. No telemetry, no voice communication, no way to know if the crew was alive or dead in mission control. The entire room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. These were men who'd trained their entire lives for moments like this. Flight directors who'd been through Apollo 1, which had killed 3 astronauts in a cabin fire. Engineers who'd experienced every conceivable failure mode in simulations. But this was different. This was real. This was 3 men they'd come to know, 3 men they'd worked with, 3 men they were now powerless to help. Gene Kranz looked at his team. "Everything is now irreversible," he said. "All we can do is wait." The clock ticked. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The normal blackout period had passed. Still nothing. Kranz asked, "Contact yet?" "Negative," came the reply. 4 minutes. 5 minutes. At NASA, at homes across America, at homes across the world, people sat in front of television sets, watching, praying, hoping. Then, at the 6-minute mark, static. A voice broke through the ionized plasma. "Houston, Odyssey. We're coming home." The command module had survived re-entry. The heat shield had held. Within minutes, parachutes deployed, slowing the capsule's descent. The 3 astronauts, exhausted and dehydrated after 4 days in a dying spacecraft, were brought to the surface of the Pacific Ocean alive. Recovery helicopters reached them within hours. USS Iwo Jima, the recovery ship, was standing by. The 3 astronauts were lifted to safety on April 17, 1970, at 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time. Apollo 13 splashed down in the South Pacific. The mission that was supposed to end in triumph, a lunar surface, had ended in survival. What happened on Apollo 13 was called a successful failure. The mission didn't accomplish its primary objective. Jim Lovell never set foot on the moon. None of them did. But they did something more important. They survived, and they survived because of 3 things: incredible teamwork, the ingenuity of hundreds of engineers in Houston, and the knowledge and skill of 3 astronauts who kept their cool when everything was falling apart. Gene Lovell, the man who knew his spacecraft was dying, didn't panic. He didn't give up. He stayed focused, worked the problem, and trusted his training. And because he did, 3 men came home alive after Apollo 13. NASA made significant changes to spacecraft design and safety protocols. Future missions were safer because of the lessons learned. But more than that, Apollo 13 showed the world what humans could do when they faced impossible odds. It showed that courage, intelligence, and teamwork could overcome catastrophe. Jim Lovell lived to be 97 years old. Passing away in August 2025, he spent his later years talking about the Apollo 13 mission, writing about it, reflecting on those 4 days when he and his crew were fighting for their lives 200,000 miles from home. When asked if he was ever afraid, Lovell said something remarkable: "We never got to a point where we said, well, we're going to die. We always believed we could solve the problem. We always believed we could find our way home." That belief, more than anything else, is what saved Apollo 13. If you want to learn more about the Apollo 13 mission, I've included links in the description to NASA's official records, to Jim Lovell's book Lost Moon, and to documentaries about the mission. This incredible story deserves to be remembered. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what aspect of the Apollo 13 mission fascinated you most. And if you have friends who love history and incredible true stories, share this video with them, because the story of Apollo 13 is a story we should never forget. See you in the next video.